They called him the janitor for 3 years. Not to his face, never to his face. But the way Jeffrey Preston said maintenance staff at the quarterly all hands, drawing it out like it had extra syllables, like the words themselves needed to be handled with gloves, that said everything. The way Bryce Tanner's assistant never offered him coffee when she wheeled the cart past the boardroom door. The way the receptionist at Hartwell and Voss Financial stopped making eye contact somewhere around March of his second year, as if looking directly at Eldon Graves might contaminate something. His name was Eldon Graves, and he was not the janitor. He was the Facilities and Infrastructure Director for the entire Eastern Division. He had a master's degree in civil engineering from the University of Toronto, and 17 years of experience managing multi-site operations for companies whose names you would recognize. He had rebuilt a broken HVAC system at a hospital in Hamilton during a February ice storm. He had overseen a $40 million renovation at a logistics campus in Mississauga without a single contractor dispute going to arbitration. His resume was not a humble document. None of that mattered at Hartwell and Voss. What mattered at Hartwell and Voss was whether you arrived in a car that announced itself, whether your jacket had a certain kind of collar, whether you used the elevator that required a key card for the executive floors or the one that opened directly from the lobby. Eldon Graves used the lobby elevator. He wore the same 4 jackets in rotation. His 2009 Civic had a slow leak in the rear left tire that he kept meaning to fix and never did. And so they decided quietly, in the way that certain offices make decisions without ever holding a meeting, that Eldon Graves was the help. It started small. It always starts small. The first time was a Tuesday in October, maybe 8 months after he had joined. A pipe fitting in the third-floor kitchen had been leaking since the previous week. Eldon Graves had submitted the service request and was waiting on the building management company. Hartwell and Voss didn't own the building. They leased it to schedule the repair. He was on the phone with the property manager when Dale Pritchard, a senior analyst who had been with the firm 11 years and wore his tenure like a medal, walked into the kitchen, looked directly at Eldon Graves, and said, "While you're here, can you take a look at the sink? Been dripping for days." Eldon Graves was the one who had logged the work order. He was the one who had called the property manager. Twice. He was, at that moment, actively on the phone trying to get it fixed. He said calmly, "I'm on the phone with the building manager right now, Dale." Pritchard said, "Great, so you're handling it," and left the kitchen. He did not say he was sorry. He did not ask what Eldon Graves's role was, even though they had been introduced at the firm's summer function, and Eldon had explained exactly what his job was. He simply absorbed the interaction in a way that preserved his original understanding of who Eldon Graves was and walked away. Eldon Graves stood in the kitchen for a moment after the call ended. He looked at the dripping tap, he wrote the date, the time, and Pritchard's exact words in the small black notebook he kept in his chest pocket. He had started carrying that notebook in week 2. He was going to need it. Hartwell and Voss Financial was not a large firm by Bay Street standards. 41 employees. A corner office on the 14th floor of a glass tower on King Street West. They managed private wealth. Old money, mostly, the kind that had been accumulating since the 70s and didn't need to perform its confidence because it had nowhere to go. The partners were 2 men, Jeffrey Preston, who had founded the firm, and Nathan Voss, whose name was on the door, and who had joined as a partner 12 years in. They did not particularly like each other, but had built something together that made them both wealthy enough that personal feeling was a secondary concern. Eldon Graves had been hired to replace their previous infrastructure director, a man named Tulloch, who had left under circumstances nobody fully explained, and which Eldon had been smart enough not to ask about. The hiring had gone through an HR firm in North York. Eldon had done 4 interviews, submitted a full infrastructure audit of his previous employer as a work sample, and been offered the position at a salary that was, he later learned, $30,000 less than what Tulloch had been making. He took the job anyway. He needed the work, and he told himself that the salary could be renegotiated once he had established himself. He had been telling himself that for 3 years. The thing about being Eldon Graves at Hartwell and Voss was that nothing was ever said directly. That's the part that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. There were no slurs, no explicit put-downs. Nobody ever told him he didn't belong there, or asked to see his credentials, or questioned his judgment in a meeting. That would have been too obvious, too easy to point to. Instead, it was the things that happened around him like weather. It was the way the partner's executive assistant, a woman named Sandra Kamau, who was lovely and who Eldon had a warm professional relationship with, had told him, apologetically, that Jeffrey Preston preferred to communicate about infrastructure matters through a third-party ticketing system rather than directly. That third-party system was checked every Tuesday and Thursday. If Eldon needed something urgent, he was to flag it in the system and it would be reviewed. Preston, who sat 40 feet from Eldon's office, had established a protocol to ensure they would never have to speak directly. It was the way the quarterly reports that Eldon prepared, detailed data-driven documents tracking energy usage, maintenance expenditure, contractor performance, and projected capital costs, were received at senior leadership meetings without his being in the room. He had asked once in his first year whether he might present the report directly. Nathan Voss had looked at him with the specific blankness of and who is computing whether a request is technically inappropriate and deciding that it isn't but wishing it were, and said they'd take it under advisement. They never did. It was the way the new office renovation had been managed. That was the one that had taken the most out of him. In the spring of Eldon's second year, the firm decided to renovate the 14th floor. New layout, new fixtures, new branding, new everything. A project like that should have run directly through Eldon Graves. He was the infrastructure director. This was infrastructure. This was, in the plainest possible sense, his job. Instead, Jeffrey Preston hired a contractor, a firm called Alderson Palmer, directly, without informing Eldon, without consulting him, and announced at a staff meeting that the renovation would begin in 6 weeks. Eldon Graves found out at the same staff meeting as the receptionist. He sat in that room and he kept his face very still. He had learned early that the men in this office watched his face during moments of friction the way people watch a dial on a pressure gauge. Any visible reaction would be interpreted as volatility, as evidence that he was difficult, as confirmation that their discomfort around him had always been reasonable. So he kept his face still, and he wrote the date in his notebook, and after the meeting he went back to his office and sat quietly for a few minutes before getting on with his day. He did not confront Preston. He did not send an email flagging the oversight. He requested, through the Tuesday-Thursday ticketing system, a copy of the contractor's proposed timeline and scope of work, which he received 3 days later and which he then read very carefully. He found 14 code violations, not suggestions, not best practices. Actual violations of Ontario Building Code as it applied to commercial renovation in a Class A office building, fire egress issues, inadequate load-bearing documentation, a proposed HVAC modification that would have voided the building's ventilation certification. He documented all 14. He researched each one. He pulled the relevant sections of the Ontario Building Code, the city's commercial renovation bylaws, and the building's original engineering certificate. He formatted everything into a 12-page report with citations. Then he sat on it for a week. He thought about it very carefully. He could submit the report through the ticketing system on a Tuesday or Thursday and let Preston deal with it. He could email it directly. He could walk into Preston's office and say, "Here, I found something you need to know about." But he had learned over 2.5 years that the right move was rarely the obvious move. The obvious move would be processed through whatever filter Preston had built around Eldon Graves and would emerge on the other side as something small, something presumptuous, something that confirmed whatever Preston already believed. He needed a different angle. He called the city, not to report anything, just to ask, as a facilities professional, a clarifying question about commercial renovation notification requirements. The person he spoke to was a bylaw officer named Fenn. She was helpful and precise and mentioned in passing that commercial renovations above a certain cost threshold in Toronto required a permit application filed with the city's building division, and that permit applications were public record once filed. Eldon thanked her. Then he looked up whether Alderson Palmer had filed the permit. They had not. That changed things considerably, because it meant that if the renovation proceeded, which it was scheduled to do in 4 weeks, the firm would be in violation not just of the building code, but of the city's commercial permit process. The liability didn't sit with the contractor. Not entirely. It sat with the tenant, with Hartwell and Voss. With the partners, Eldon Graves drafted a memo, not a 12-page report with citations, a single page, Plain language, clear structure, 3 paragraphs, the situation, the risk, the recommended course of action. The recommended course of action was to pause the renovation pending a permit application and a code review, to be conducted by Eldon Graves and a licensed third-party engineer. He walked into Nathan Voss's office and placed the memo on the desk. "I think you need to read this today," he said. Nathan Voss looked at the memo, then at Eldon. He was not accustomed to Eldon Graves appearing in his office. He said, "I'll take a look." Eldon Graves said, "The contractor is mobilizing in 4 weeks. I'd recommend reading it before end of day." He left. The renovation was paused. Alderson Palmer was removed from the project. A new contractor was brought in, one that Eldon recommended, a firm out of Etobicoke he had worked with in Hamilton, and the renovation was completed 8 weeks later, on budget, with a permit and no code violations. Jeffrey Preston never thanked him. He sent a single email through the ticketing system acknowledging receipt of the final contractor sign-off. That was all. Eldon Graves added the memo, the contractor communications, and the permit documentation to a folder he kept on an encrypted drive. He had been keeping a folder like this since month 3. It was organized by date and category. It was thorough. He was thorough about everything. The day that changed the direction of things was a Wednesday in February. The firm held what it called a leadership alignment meeting 4 times a year. It was nominally for all senior staff, which technically included Eldon Graves. In practice, the invitations went to 11 people: the 2 partners, the 4 portfolio managers, the compliance officer, the head of client relations, the chief financial officer, and the 2 most senior analysts. Eldon Graves was not on that list. He had never been on that list. In his first year, he had received an invitation by accident. A calendar assistant had added him when it auto-filled from a previous meeting attendee list, and he had shown up. He had sat in the boardroom with 11 people who received his presence with varying degrees of surprise and confusion. And he had listened, and he had said nothing, and nobody had asked him to leave because they were all too polished to do something that obvious. Afterwards, the calendar assistant had been quietly corrected. He had not received an invitation since. On this particular Wednesday in February, the meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock. At 12:30, Eldon Graves received a phone call from the building management company. Not the partners, not HR, the building management company, informing him that the 14th floor HVAC system had flagged an anomaly and that a diagnostic needed to be run. He ran the diagnostic. He found that a component in the primary air handling unit had been misaligned, probably during a routine maintenance visit the previous week, and was causing a pressure imbalance that, if left uncorrected, would result in inadequate airflow to approximately 2/3 of the office floor by mid-afternoon. The boardroom was in those 2/3. He could fix it. He had the part. It would take about 45 minutes. He could also wait. Let the meeting proceed. Let the room get warm and stuffy and uncomfortable the way a room does when the airflow drops off and 14 people are sitting in it and nobody can figure out why they all feel slightly irritable and unfocused. He fixed it. He fixed it because that was his job, and because letting a preventable problem happen to make a point was not something he was willing to do. He had made himself a promise a long time ago that he would not become the thing that the people around him seemed to want him to be: diminished, reactive, defined by what was done to him rather than what he did. He fixed it in 38 minutes, logged the repair in the maintenance system, and submitted a note through the ticketing system, recommending a full inspection of the maintenance vendor's recent work. Nobody acknowledged it. He had not expected them to. The thing about Eldon Graves that people at Hartwell and Voss consistently failed to account for was that he was not suffering. This is important to understand. He was not a man counting down the days, not a man going home to a dark apartment to catalog his wounds. He had a daughter, Renata, who was 24 and doing a graduate program in architecture at Dalhousie. He had a sister in Brampton who made jerk chicken the way their mother had, and they ate together most Sundays. He had a group of men he had known since Scarborough who played pickup basketball at a gym off Lawrence every other Saturday. And he was still, at 51, the smartest player in that gym at reading the floor, which gave him an uncomplicated satisfaction. He was fine. He had been fine in situations that would have leveled other people, but he was also paying attention. He had always been paying attention. And what he was watching, in those 3 years at Hartwell and Voss, was a system, the way it worked, the way it distributed credit and access and regard, the way it was held together. And more specifically, the places where it was held together with assumptions rather than anything structural. Companies that run on assumptions about people are companies that have exposure they don't know about. Eldon Graves knew about theirs. In late March of his third year, Jeffrey Preston announced that the firm was undergoing a regulatory audit. The Ontario Securities Commission had flagged a discrepancy in the firm's reporting structure, specifically around how certain client portfolio activities were being categorized for compliance purposes. It was not a criminal matter, Preston emphasized twice in the staff announcement. It was an administrative irregularity. It would be resolved. What Preston did not say, and what Eldon Graves understood from reading the public notice on the OSC's website, was that part of the audit would cover the firm's operational infrastructure, its record-keeping systems, its data management, its physical and digital security protocols. That was not a peripheral concern. That was Eldon Graves's domain. He submitted a request through the ticketing system to be included in the audit preparation process. The response came back Thursday. The audit preparation was being managed by the CFO and outside counsel. Eldon's role would be to provide documentation as requested. He would provide documentation as requested. He would also, separately, conduct his own review of the firm's infrastructure compliance posture, not because he was asked to, because he had been the infrastructure director for 3 years, and he knew things about this building and this firm's operations that nobody else in that office knew, and if the OSC asked a question that nobody could answer, the answer would eventually lead back to him anyway. He worked on it evenings. He was methodical. He cross-referenced the firm's data management practices against FinTrack reporting requirements, against OAC Rule 31-103, against the privacy obligations under PIPI. He found, over the course of 6 weeks, a significant gap in how the firm was documenting its vendor access to client data systems. Not a violation exactly, a gap, an ambiguity. The kind of ambiguity that in an audit becomes a problem because auditors do not like ambiguity. Auditors like documentation. There was no documentation. Eldon Graves wrote it. He created a vendor access protocol, retrospectively documented the firm's existing practices in compliance with that protocol, and prepared an audit-ready data management annex that addressed the OSC's areas of concern directly. He submitted it through the ticketing system on a Tuesday. Thursday's response, "Thank you. This will be shared with outside counsel." He did not hear anything more about it for 3 weeks. Then Renata called him on a Sunday evening from Halifax, and she asked how things were going at work, and he told her, honestly, that they were going the same way they had been going. She was quiet for a moment. She was like him in that way. She thought before she spoke. She said, "Dad, how long are you going to wait?" He said, "I'm not waiting for anything." She said, "You are? You've been building a case for 3 years, that's waiting." He didn't say anything. She said, "I'm just asking. What does the end of this look like to you? Because I think you know what you want to happen. I think you've known for a while." He drove home from his sister's in Brampton in the dark, and he thought about that, and he decided that Renata was right. He had known. He had been letting circumstances accumulate because he was careful, and because he did not want to be wrong, and because he had learned a long time ago that you don't move until you know where you're going. He knew where he was going. The OSC audit hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in May. The week before, Eldon Graves requested a meeting with both partners, not through the ticketing system. He sent a direct email to both Preston and Voss, calendar invite included, subject line, "Infrastructure Audit Readiness, Meeting Requested." Preston's assistant responded that Preston's schedule was full that week. Eldon replied, "I understand. I'd recommend making time before Tuesday. I have materials relevant to the OSC review that outside counsel does not currently have." The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 3. He sat across the table from 2 men who had spent 3 years looking slightly past him, and he placed a document on the table. 31 pages, clean, precise, indexed. He said, "I've been conducting an independent infrastructure compliance review since the audit was announced. This document covers 6 areas of potential concerns that are currently outside the scope of what outside counsel has reviewed. The vendor access protocol, starting on page 12, addresses a gap that, if surfaced by the OSC, would have no documented response. Now it does." Jeffrey Preston looked at the document, then at Eldon Graves. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite any single emotion. He said, "This wasn't requested." Eldon Graves said, "No, I did it because it needed to be done." Nathan Voss picked up the document. He turned to page 12. He read for a moment. He said, "How long did this take you?" 6 weeks, Eld said. "Evenings, mostly." Voss set the document down. He looked at Preston. Something was passing between them that Eldon didn't try to read. Voss said, "I'd like to walk through this before Tuesday." Eldon said, "I'm available Thursday evening or anytime Friday." Outside counsel reviewed the vendor access protocol. They used it in the audit. The OSC closed its inquiry into Hartwell and Voss's operational infrastructure with no findings. A conclusion the audit letter attributed, in part, to the comprehensive and proactive documentation of vendor access controls. That language came from a document that had not existed until Eldon Graves wrote it in his living room on weeknights over 6 weeks. Nobody said his name in the room when the letter was read. He found that out from Sandra Kamau, who told him quietly, one morning by the elevators, that the partners had been very relieved. She said it in the careful way that people say things when they are trying to give you information without being seen giving it. He thanked her. He meant it. 2 weeks after the audit closed, Jeffrey Preston appeared in the doorway of Eldon Graves' office. This was not a thing that had happened before. In 3 years, Preston had not once come to Eldon's office. Eldon had a brief, involuntary thought about the fact that he had never been offered a chair in Preston's office either, and then he set that thought aside. Preston said, "You have a few minutes?" They sat. Preston had brought a copy of the 31-page document. He had annotated it. There were sticky notes on multiple pages. He said, "I want to talk about scope, your role, what it actually is versus what we've been treating it as." Eldon Graves sat still. He let that sentence hang in the air exactly as long as it needed to. Preston said, "There's a gap between what you're being paid and what you're doing. I think we've managed this position poorly." He paused. "I want to propose a restructured mandate and a compensation review." Voss and I talked. Eldon said, "All right." Preston said, "The renovation issue. In year 2, you handled that correctly. We didn't." Eldon said, "I appreciated the outcome." Preston looked at him for a moment. He seemed to be deciding whether to say something else. He said, "I don't always read people well. I know that about myself. I'm going to say that directly." Eldon Graves looked at the man across the desk from him. He thought about the notebook in his chest pocket. He thought about Tuesday and Thursday. He thought about the staff meeting where he had found out about the renovation at the same time as the receptionist. He said, "I appreciate you saying it." He did not say he appreciated it in the past. He did not say things were fine. He let the sentence carry exactly the weight it needed to carry, and no more. The restructured mandate was real. The compensation review added $42,000 to his annual salary. The new title was Vice President of Infrastructure and Operations. He was added to the Leadership Alignment Meeting distribution list. He was given a seat, physical, actual, in the boardroom. Dale Pritchard saw him there at the first one. Pritchard sat down across from him, and something in Pritchard's expression recalibrated in real time, the way a face adjusts when a situation has changed and the adjustment is slightly uncomfortable. Eldon Graves nodded at him, pleasant and even, the way he always had been. Pritchard nodded back. The meeting began. That fall, Eldon's daughter, Renata, came home for Thanksgiving. Drove up from Halifax 14 hours because she refused to fly, and she said she liked having time to think. She arrived on the Saturday, exhausted and happy, and she sat in his kitchen and ate leftover jerk chicken cold from the container while he told her about the last 6 months. She listened without interrupting. She was like him in that way, too. When he finished, she said, "They gave you the title. They gave you the salary." He said, "Yes," she said, "but not the apology." He considered that. He said, "Preston said what he said. That was as close as he gets." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is that enough?" He looked at his daughter, 24 years old, studying how buildings hold themselves together, same eyes as her grandmother, and he said, "Enough for what?" She thought about it. She said, "For it to have been worth it." He said, "Renata, I built something. In the middle of all of that, I built something that wasn't there before. That's mine. That doesn't go anywhere." She looked at him the way she sometimes did, the way that made him feel like she was already 45, and he was the one who had something left to learn. She said, "Okay, Dad." She stole the last of the chicken. He let her. The building on King Street West was still there the following Monday. His name was on a new office door, one floor up, facing north. The CN Tower was visible from the window on clear days. He had not asked for the north-facing office. Voss had arranged it. He stood at that window on his first morning in the room, with a coffee he had made himself in the quiet before anyone else arrived, and he looked at the city that had taken everything he had given it, and had not always given it back fairly, and he thought about his mother, who had come to this country with a single suitcase and a refusal to be made small, and he thought that she would have had something to say about all of this, and whatever she would have said, it would have been short, and it would have been enough. He drank his coffee. He went to work.